Thank you so much for watching YouTube. Of course, I want to encourage you to subscribe because we've got really good things happening. And we're continuing our series on what to do in a crisis. How do you manage a crisis? And I think this is very, very relevant, particularly now. This is super, super important and helpful to us. And so we're looking at part 2 today, and we're continuing to look at Daniel, because Daniel had a lot of crises. I mean, seriously. And Daniel was living at this time in Babylon, the kingdom of Babylon. A bunch of Jews had been exiled into Babylon, and Daniel was considered one of the wise men among the Jewish people for advising the king of Babylon, whose name was Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar. I learned how to spell that when I was little, and I thought it was a major achievement. That was a little rabbit trail. But anyways, so what happens here in Daniel chapter 3, here's an interesting crisis, because Daniel chapter 2, we read the crisis about Nebuchadnezzar having a dream and how God brought Daniel through that crisis with tremendous victory. But in Daniel chapter 3, we read another crisis. And I don't understand why we have it's like crisis, 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 one after another. So kind of like dominoes, it's like sequential. And maybe you feel like that right now. It's like this domino effect with, a healthcare crisis and then a financial crisis. And then, it's like a mental, emotional crisis. I mean, all these things could just be like boom, 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 boom. And I think in some respects, that's how Daniel was when we read about him in chapter 2, and then now exactly in chapter 3. And in chapter 3, here's the crisis. Nebuchadnezzar builds a golden image, this giant statue, and he makes this nationwide decree that on such and such a day, everybody has to bow down to this golden statue of Nebuchadnezzar. Well, the Jewish men, Daniel and his buddies, they're like, we can't do that. We only will worship Yahweh, Jehovah, the true God. We're not going to bow down to an idol. It goes against our religious principles. And so, and King Nebuchadnezzar says, if you don't bow down, anybody who doesn't across the kingdom is going to be thrown into the fiery furnace. So Daniel and his friends, there's this anticipation, because the calendar's coming day after day, getting closer and closer and closer to the bow down day to the golden idol. And Daniel and his friends, they anticipate this crisis, and they're like, ugh, what are we going to do? Are we going to hold the line? Are we going to stay true to our faith, worship God? And it gets closer and closer, and I would anticipate they got more and more, get more and more nervous. When you see a crisis coming, sometimes I think the anticipation of a crisis sometimes can be a little bit worse sometimes than the crisis. Not always. That's not always true. But I don't know about you. I've had that in my heart where I know something and it's imminent. It's an impending disaster, and I anticipate it, and like, ugh. And waiting for it can sometimes be a struggle in and of itself. And so they decided, and I think they came together as a group of guys, and said, we're going to hold the line. We're going to stay true in our faith and our heart, our worship to the genuine God. We're not going to bow down to an idol. Period. End of story. Full stop. And so the day comes. So they anticipated the day. The day comes, and that's exactly what happens. Everybody bows down, but all of Daniel and his friends, they don't bow down. So they're the outliers. They're the standouts. And it creates a major crisis, because they know if we don't do this, then it's the fiery furnace. And what happens is everybody's like, oh, they watch Daniel and his friends not bow down. And so they get apprehended, they get, arrested, and they tie him up, and they take him to the fiery furnace. And King Nebuchadnezzar is super ticked off that they would defy his national decree and all this stuff. So he stokes the furnace like 7 times hotter. So this is so bad. And it even says this in Daniel chapter 3. I mean, you talk about a crisis. You talk about going through the fire. Literally, that's exactly what happens. In Daniel chapter 3, the guys who were leading them to throw them into the fiery furnace, those guys died because the furnace was so hot. I mean, seriously. And so they throw these Jewish guys into the fiery furnace. And it's fascinating because they're all tied up with ropes and everything. And the king King Nebuchadnezzar looks in the fiery furnace. And I like what happens, because even in the midst of the fiery furnace, the king recognizes and sees none of these guys are burning up. And he also sees there's a fourth guy in the furnace, and he looks like the Son of God. That's exactly what Nebuchadnezzar says. And I love, this crisis is super, super helpful to us. Because when these guys go through it, they anticipate the crisis. They're like, it's coming, it's coming, it's coming. But they say this, King, we're not going to bow down to you. Even if you throw us into the fire, we're not bowing down. We're going to follow God and destroy, full stop. Even if we burn up, we're not giving up, sacrificing. We're not relinquishing our faith. And I would challenge you, in the midst of this fiery furnace, don't give up your faith in God. Don't quit. Don't say, God, you blew it. God, you're not enough. God, you didn't come through. Don't quit on God. Don't give up your faith, because your faith has great reward. And Galatians, Ephesians talks about that. And don't get weary in well-doing. Don't quit on your faith. Ask God, help me. And I love there's a guy in the Gospels that comes to Jesus and says, Lord, I believe, help my unbelief. And even if you're struggling with unbelief in this time, and you're like, I know I should, but I'm just having a hard time, I would challenge you, just make that available, make that honest prayer to God. I'm struggling in believing you. I'm struggling in keeping my faith. Please help me. Please help me in my weaknesses. Help me in my weak spot. Help me to sense that fourth man in the fire with me, Jesus Christ, the Son of God. Because when we come through the fire, what happens is Jesus is glorified. Jesus is exalted. And that's exactly when the king fishes out the men from the fiery furnace, they're all alive. There's no smell of smoke on them. There's no ropes and stuff tying them down. They're free, and they absolutely glorify God, who brought them through, delivered them through the fiery furnace. Sometimes we want to avoid stuff, but God says, I can, whether it's delivering you from it or taking you through it, God is absolutely sovereign, in control, powerful, and can help us, even going through a fiery furnace. So if you're in a crisis, you're feeling a crisis, you feel like you're in the fiery furnace, keep walking, keep trusting in God. Look for Jesus. Jesus is present in that fiery furnace. You can sense God and ask him, help me to sense you, God. Help me to recognize you. Help me to feel you. Help me to see you here. Help me to know that you're present. Because Jesus is present. He never leaves us, and he never forsakes us. So I just encourage you today, God has good things for us, even in the midst of a major crisis. No matter what, God is still in control, and he can bring us through, or he can deliver us from. But God is able, and he does. He does on a consistent, regular basis keep our confidence in God. So thank you so much for watching. Give me some feedback. And thank you for subscribing. Really appreciate it. Hit that little bell, because then you get like notifications. They keep you posted on when we post new content. And of course, we want our joke here at the end, because these jokes, I know, right now you especially need a lot of levity. Seriously. So here's your joke. Never take advice from an electron, because they're always negative, as opposed to a proton or a neutron. Catch you next week.